Deep beneath the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, carved into clay tablets that have survived floods, wars, and the collapse of entire civilizations, lies a story that challenges everything we think we know about human history. Not the sanitized version taught in textbooks, but something far more unsettling. A tale of gods who walked among mortals, of genetic manipulation conducted thousands of years before we supposedly discovered DNA, and of a single entity whose decisions may have shaped the very foundations of human civilization. His name was Enlil, and if the ancient Sumerian texts are to be believed, he wasn't just a mythological figure, he was the architect of humanity's destiny. Tonight, we're going to explore the forbidden chapters of our past. We're going to examine evidence that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge, decipher texts that scholars dismiss as mythology, and ask the questions that make academics uncomfortable. Because what if the stories our ancestors carved into stone weren't myths at all? What if they were memories? You see, when most people hear the word Anunnaki, they think of fringe theories and conspiracy documentaries. But here's what they don't tell you. The Sumerian civilization appeared seemingly overnight around 3500 BCE with no clear evolutionary path. They had advanced mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, complex legal systems, and detailed knowledge of our solar system that wouldn't be rediscovered until the invention of telescopes. They described planets we didn't officially find until the 20th century, and at the center of their pantheon sat Enlil, not just a god, but what the texts describe as the supreme commander of Earth operations for an extraterrestrial species that had been manipulating human development for millennia. I've spent years studying these ancient texts, not through the lens of mythology, but as historical documents. What I've found isn't just fascinating, it's terrifying. Because if even half of what these tablets describe is accurate, then everything we believe about human origins, about our rapid technological advancement, about the rise and fall of ancient civilizations, needs to be completely re-examined. And the implications go far beyond ancient history. The patterns described in these texts, the genetic modifications, the social engineering, the deliberate manipulation of human consciousness, they didn't end with the ancient world. They evolved. So before we dive into this rabbit hole, I need you to understand something. We're not just talking about dusty archaeology or abstract mythology. We're talking about a systematic program of human control that may have been running for thousands of years. And the entity at the center of it all, Enlil, may have been far more than just an ancient god. He may have been the original architect of human civilization as we know it. The story begins in what we now call Iraq, in the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Around 3500 BCE, something extraordinary happened. The Sumerian civilization exploded onto the scene with a sophistication that should have taken thousands of years to develop. They had writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, and complex social structures, all appearing simultaneously as if someone had flipped a switch. Mainstream historians call this the Neolithic Revolution, but they can't explain why it happened so suddenly, or why the Sumerians possessed knowledge that seems impossible for their time period. Knowledge like the precise orbital periods of planets, the structure of our solar system, and detailed descriptions of genetic manipulation techniques. But the Sumerians themselves weren't mysterious about their origins. They told us exactly where their knowledge came from. According to their own records, it was given to them by the Anunnaki, literally translated as those who from heaven to earth came. And leading this group of celestial visitors was Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Wind or Lord of the Command. Now, here's where things get interesting. The Sumerian texts don't describe Enlil as some ethereal, all-powerful deity floating in the clouds. They describe him in remarkably human terms. He eats, he drinks, he gets angry, he makes decisions, he argues with other members of his species. The tablets describe him as having a physical body, a specific role within a hierarchical organization, and clear, measurable objectives for his operations on Earth. According to the Enuma Elish and other Sumerian creation texts, Enlil wasn't originally supposed to be in charge of Earth. That responsibility initially belonged to his half-brother Enki, also known as Ea. But through a series of political maneuvers that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's story, Enlil seized control of what the tablets call the Earth Station. And this is where our story really begins to get disturbing. The tablets describe a species, the Anunnaki, that had been mining Earth for precious metals, particularly gold, for hundreds of thousands of years. But there was a problem. The work was brutal, dangerous, and the Anunnaki workers were beginning to rebel. Sound familiar? It should, because it's the same labor problem that every advanced civilization eventually faces. But Enlil's solution wasn't to improve working conditions or develop better technology. His solution was to create a workforce that couldn't rebel, a species intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, but psychologically programmed to serve without question. According to the texts, this is how humanity was born, not through natural evolution, but through deliberate genetic engineering designed to create the perfect slave species. The Atrahasis epic describes this process in detail that's both fascinating and horrifying. It explains how Enki, despite his reservations, was forced to combine Anunnaki genetic material with that of existing hominids to create what they called the Adamu, the first humans. But here's the crucial part. Enlil insisted that these new beings be programmed with specific psychological limitations. They would be intelligent enough to work and follow complex instructions, but they would never be able to fully comprehend their true nature or their creator's real agenda. Think about that for a moment. According to these ancient texts, the fundamental characteristics that define human psychology, our tendency toward hierarchy, our susceptibility to authority, our need for external validation, our capacity for self-deception, weren't natural evolutionary traits. They were deliberately programmed features designed to ensure our compliance. But the experiment didn't go according to plan. The tablets describe repeated attempts by early humans to break free from their programming, to achieve true consciousness and independence. And every time this happened, Enlil's response was swift and brutal. The Great Flood, according to Sumerian sources, wasn't a natural disaster or divine punishment for sin. It was Enlil's final solution to what he saw as a failed experiment, an attempt to wipe out humanity and start over with a more controllable model. Only the intervention of Enki, who secretly warned a human named Utnapishtim, later called Noah in Hebrew texts, prevented the complete extinction of our species. But even this act of mercy came with conditions. The humans who survived would be even more psychologically dependent on their creators, even more susceptible to manipulation and control. And here's where the story gets truly chilling. The tablets suggest that Enlil's reshaping of human civilization didn't end with the flood. According to Sumerian records, he continued to intervene in human affairs for thousands of years, always working behind the scenes to ensure that our development followed his predetermined path. Every major leap in human civilization, the development of agriculture, the rise of city-states, the invention of writing, the establishment of organized religion, the tablets suggest these weren't natural human achievements. They were carefully orchestrated steps in Enlil's long-term plan for human development. Consider the timing. Agriculture appears simultaneously in multiple locations around the world around 10,000 BCE, with no clear evolutionary progression from hunter-gatherer societies. Writing systems emerge independently in Sumeria, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China within a relatively short time frame. Complex astronomical knowledge appears in cultures that had no apparent contact with each other. Mainstream historians call this convergent evolution, but the Sumerian texts offer a different explanation. They suggest that Enlil and his agents were actively seeding human populations with specific knowledge and technologies, always carefully calibrated to advance our civilization without allowing us to become truly independent. And the most disturbing part. The tablets suggest that this process of guided evolution included the deliberate introduction of concepts that would keep humanity divided and controllable. The establishment of competing religions, each claiming exclusive access to divine truth. The development of nationalism and tribal identity that would ensure constant conflict. The creation of economic systems that would keep the majority of humans focused on survival rather than questioning the nature of their existence. Look at the pattern. Every time a human civilization begins to approach true independence, to develop technologies or philosophical systems that might threaten the established order, something happens. Wars break out, plagues appear, natural disasters strike, civilizations collapse, and humanity is forced to start over, always following the same basic template that Enlil established thousands of years ago. The Library of Alexandria burns. The Mayan civilization mysteriously collapses at its height. The Roman Empire falls just as it begins to develop technologies that might have led to an early industrial revolution. Advanced civilizations in India and China stagnate despite their early advantages. Time and again, just as humanity seems poised to break free from the limitations built into our psychological programming, external forces intervene to reset our development. But here's what makes this story more than just ancient mythology. The Sumerian tablets don't just describe past events. They contain predictions about humanity's future development. And many of these predictions are coming true with disturbing accuracy. The texts describe a time when humans would develop the ability to manipulate their own genetics, to create artificial intelligence, to travel beyond Earth's atmosphere. But they also describe this period as extremely dangerous, a time when humanity might finally develop the capability to break free from the psychological limitations built into our species. According to the tablets, this is when Enlil would return, not as a benevolent god offering salvation, but as a control system activating its final protocols. The texts describe a period of global chaos, technological disruption, and psychological manipulation, designed to ensure that humanity's newfound capabilities are channeled in directions that serve the original agenda rather than human independence. And if you look at the world today, at the simultaneous explosion of technological capability and psychological manipulation, at the way our most advanced technologies seem to be creating more division and confusion rather than enlightenment and liberation, you have to wonder, are we living through the activation of protocols established thousands of years ago? The evidence is everywhere if you know how to look for it. The same symbols that appeared in ancient Sumerian temples show up in modern corporate logos and government buildings. The same psychological manipulation techniques described in the tablets are being used by social media algorithms and political propaganda systems. The same patterns of controlled opposition and manufactured conflict that kept ancient civilizations divided are playing out on a global scale. But there's something else in the tablets, something that mainstream researchers either ignore or actively suppress. The Sumerian texts suggest that Enlil's control system was never perfect. There have always been humans who retained some portion of their original, unmodified consciousness. Individuals who could see through the programming, who understood the true nature of human civilization and worked to preserve this knowledge for future generations. These individuals didn't fight the system directly. That would have been suicide. Instead, they embedded the truth in myths, in religious texts, in architectural monuments, in works of art. They created a hidden curriculum that would allow future generations to rediscover the truth when they were ready to handle it. And according to the tablets, that time is now. We're living in the period when humanity's technological development has finally reached the point where we can understand and potentially overcome the limitations built into our species. We have the tools to decode our own genetics, to understand the mechanisms of consciousness, to potentially break free from thousands of years of controlled evolution. But we're also living in the period when the control system is most active, most desperate to prevent this awakening from occurring. The same forces that guided human development for millennia are now working overtime to ensure that our advanced capabilities are turned against us rather than used for genuine liberation. This is why understanding Enlil's story isn't just academic curiosity, it's survival. Because if the Sumerian tablets are accurate, we're not just facing a political or economic crisis. We're facing the final phase of a control system that has been operating for thousands of years, a system designed to prevent humanity from ever achieving true independence or understanding our real nature. And at the center of this system, according to the ancient texts, sits the same consciousness that reshaped human civilization at the dawn of history. Enlil, the Lord of the Command, the architect of human limitation, still active, still working, still determined to ensure that humanity never breaks free from the cage he built for us thousands of years ago. The question isn't whether this sounds impossible or far-fetched. The question is, what if it's true? What if everything we think we know about human history, about our nature as a species, about our potential for the future, has been deliberately distorted to keep us from understanding our real situation? And if that's the case, what do we do about it? The answer to that question lies buried in the most heavily guarded secrets of our ancient past. Because what the mainstream archaeological community doesn't want you to know is that the Sumerian tablets contain detailed technical specifications, not vague mythological descriptions, but precise instructions for genetic manipulation, consciousness programming, and social engineering that read like a manual for species management. When you examine these texts with modern scientific understanding, the level of detail becomes impossible to dismiss as primitive mythology. The tablets describe cellular structure, genetic inheritance patterns, and neurological programming techniques that we're only beginning to understand today. They explain how memories can be implanted, how behavioral patterns can be hard-coded into genetic material, and how entire populations can be psychologically conditioned through carefully orchestrated cultural programming. But here's where it gets really interesting. The tablets don't just describe what was done to humanity in the past. They provide a roadmap for recognizing when these same techniques are being used in the present. And when you apply this ancient knowledge to analyze modern society, the patterns become undeniable. Take our educational system, for example. The Sumerian texts describe how Enlil established schools designed not to teach critical thinking, but to program specific behavioral responses. Students were taught to memorize and repeat information without questioning its source or validity. They were conditioned to seek approval from authority figures and to compete against each other rather than collaborate. Sound familiar? Now look at our modern educational system. Same structure, same psychological conditioning, just scaled up to handle billions of people instead of thousands. We call it progress, but the fundamental programming remains unchanged. We're still creating compliant workers rather than independent thinkers, still conditioning people to seek external validation rather than developing internal wisdom. Or consider our economic system. The tablets describe how Enlil introduced the concept of artificial scarcity, the idea that there isn't enough to go around, so people must compete for limited resources. This wasn't based on actual resource limitations, but on psychological manipulation designed to keep people focused on survival, rather than questioning the nature of their existence. Today, we live on a planet with abundant resources and advanced technology that could easily provide for everyone's needs. Yet we maintain economic systems based on artificial scarcity, designed to keep the majority of humanity in a constant state of stress and competition. We've been programmed to believe this is natural, inevitable, the way things have to be. But according to the ancient texts, it's just another layer of control. The tablets also describe something they call the Great Forgetting, a systematic process of erasing human memory of our true origins and capabilities. This wasn't just about destroying physical records, though that certainly happened. It was about conditioning humans to forget how to access their own consciousness, how to think independently, how to recognize manipulation when they see it. And this process is still active today. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, Yet most people know less about the fundamental nature of reality than their ancestors did thousands of years ago. We have more entertainment than any civilization in history, yet rates of depression, anxiety, and existential despair are skyrocketing. We have more communication technology than ever before, yet people feel more isolated and disconnected than previous generations. This isn't accidental. According to the Sumerian texts, it's the predictable result of consciousness suppression techniques that have been refined over millennia. We've been programmed to seek distraction rather than understanding, to consume rather than create, to react rather than respond thoughtfully to the world around us. But here's what Enlil and his successors didn't anticipate: the human spirit's remarkable resilience. Despite thousands of years of genetic and psychological manipulation, some humans have always retained the ability to see beyond the programming. These individuals have kept the truth alive through secret societies, mystery schools, and hidden traditions that preserved ancient knowledge even during the darkest periods of human history. The Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the mystery schools of Egypt and Greece, indigenous shamanic traditions around the world, all of these groups maintained fragments of the original human knowledge that Enlil tried to erase. They understood that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but channeled through it. They knew that humans are capable of abilities that mainstream science still refuses to acknowledge. They preserved techniques for accessing higher states of awareness that could potentially override the psychological programming built into our species. And now, for the first time in thousands of years, this hidden knowledge is becoming accessible to ordinary people. The internet, despite all its problems, has created unprecedented opportunities for sharing suppressed information. Scientific research, despite institutional resistance, is beginning to validate ancient understanding of consciousness and human potential. Global communication networks are allowing people to compare notes and recognize patterns that would have been impossible to detect in isolation. This is why we're living through such a period of chaos and upheaval. The control system that Enlil established is being challenged like never before. The psychological programming that kept humanity compliant for millennia is starting to break down as more people wake up to the reality of their situation. But the system isn't going down without a fight. The same consciousness that reshaped human civilization at the dawn of history is now deploying increasingly desperate measures to maintain control. Mass media manipulation, pharmaceutical intervention, environmental toxification, electromagnetic frequency modification, all techniques designed to keep human consciousness suppressed and manageable. The tablets describe this final phase as a time of great testing, when humanity would either break free from its limitations or be locked into an even more restrictive form of control. We're living through that test right now. Every day, each of us makes choices that either support our awakening or reinforce our programming. Every time we think for ourselves instead of accepting what we're told, every time we choose love over fear, every time we refuse to be divided against our fellow humans, we're participating in humanity's potential liberation. But we're also facing forces that have been manipulating human consciousness for thousands of years. Forces that understand our psychology better than we understand ourselves, that have been studying our weaknesses and exploiting them with scientific precision. The same entities that convinced our ancestors to worship their oppressors as gods are now using even more sophisticated techniques to maintain their control. Consider how perfectly modern propaganda mirrors the techniques described in the ancient tablets. Create multiple competing narratives, all serving the same agenda but appearing to offer choice. Trigger emotional responses that bypass rational thinking. Use repetition and authority figures to implant ideas directly into the subconscious mind. Divide populations against each other so they never unite against their real oppressors. The tablets describe these as Enlil's core strategies for population control, refined over thousands of years of experimentation on human consciousness. And if you look at modern society with this understanding, you can see these same patterns playing out everywhere. In politics, in media, in education, in entertainment, in social movements that appear to oppose the system but actually serve to reinforce it. But there's something else in the ancient texts, something that gives me hope despite the overwhelming nature of what we're facing. The Sumerian tablets suggest that Enlil's control system contains a fatal flaw. It depends entirely on human unconsciousness. It only works as long as people don't understand what's being done to them. The moment humans begin to wake up, to see through the illusions and recognize the manipulation, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Because consciousness, once activated, is impossible to suppress permanently. Truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. And humans, once awakened to their real nature and potential, become impossible to control through the old methods. This is why the ancient mystery schools taught that knowledge is power, but self-knowledge is the ultimate power. When you understand your own consciousness, when you recognize your own programming, when you see how your thoughts and emotions are being manipulated, you can begin to break free from patterns that have controlled human behavior for millennia. The tablets describe certain humans who achieved this level of awareness, individuals who the Anunnaki called the awakened ones, or those who remember. These weren't mythical figures or supernatural beings. They were ordinary humans who had learned to access their unmodified consciousness, who could see beyond the illusions that kept their contemporaries trapped in psychological slavery. And according to the texts, these awakened individuals possessed abilities that seem impossible from our current limited understanding of human potential. They could communicate telepathically, manipulate energy fields, access information from the collective human consciousness, and even influence physical reality through focused intention. Mainstream science dismisses these abilities as supernatural nonsense, but recent research in quantum physics, consciousness studies, and neuroscience is beginning to validate what ancient humans apparently took for granted. We're discovering that consciousness is not a byproduct of brain activity, but a fundamental force that shapes reality at the quantum level. We're learning that human DNA contains vast amounts of information that appears to be inactive, but may actually be dormant capabilities waiting to be triggered. We're finding that the human brain is capable of processing and transmitting information in ways that conventional neuroscience cannot explain. What if these aren't new discoveries, but rediscoveries of abilities that were deliberately suppressed thousands of years ago? What if the genetic modifications described in the Sumerian tablets didn't just create psychological limitations, but also disabled capabilities that were part of our original design? The implications are staggering. If humans once possessed abilities that we've forgotten how to access, if our current limitations are artificial rather than natural, then everything about our understanding of human potential needs to be reconsidered. We might be capable of far more than we've been programmed to believe. But with that potential comes responsibility. Because if the ancient texts are accurate, we're not just facing a political or social revolution, we're facing an evolutionary crisis that will determine the future of human consciousness itself. The choices we make in the next few decades could either lead to genuine human liberation or to an even more sophisticated form of control that would make Enlil's original system look primitive by comparison. The technology exists today to implement the kind of total consciousness control that previous generations could only dream of. Artificial intelligence systems that can predict and manipulate human behavior with unprecedented precision. Genetic engineering techniques that could modify human consciousness at the biological level. Electromagnetic frequency systems that can influence brain function remotely. Nanotechnology that could monitor and control human thoughts from within. If these technologies are deployed by the same consciousness that created our current control system, humanity could find itself locked into a prison of the mind that would be virtually impossible to escape. We would become even more perfectly programmed slaves than our ancestors ever were, controlled not just through external manipulation, but through direct intervention in our neurological processes. But there's another possibility. If enough humans wake up to the reality of our situation, if we can reclaim our suppressed capabilities and learn to use our advanced technology for genuine liberation rather than enhanced control, We might finally be able to break free from the limitations that have defined human civilization since its inception. This is the real battle we're facing. Not left versus right, not one nation against another, not even good versus evil in the traditional sense. It's a battle for the future of human consciousness itself, a battle that will determine whether we remain unconscious slaves to forces we don't understand, or whether we finally become the fully conscious sovereign beings we were apparently designed to be before Enlil's intervention. And according to the ancient tablets, this battle was always inevitable. The control system was never meant to last forever. It was designed to guide human development until we reached a point where we could either transcend our limitations or be permanently contained within them. That point is now. The test is happening. And the outcome depends entirely on how many humans choose to wake up before it's too late. The ancient Sumerian tablets contain what might be the most disturbing revelation of all. Detailed descriptions of what they call the Watchers, a network of hybrid beings created by Enlil to monitor and manage human populations across the globe. These weren't gods or demons in the mythological sense, but sophisticated biological constructs designed to serve as intermediaries between the Anunnaki leadership and human civilization. According to the texts, these Watchers were strategically positioned in every major population center, disguised as priests, kings, and tribal leaders. They possessed extended lifespans, enhanced cognitive abilities, and direct communication links to Enlil's command structure. But most importantly, they were programmed with an unshakable loyalty to the original mission, maintaining human compliance and preventing any form of genuine awakening. The tablets describe how these Watchers established the first organized religions, not as genuine spiritual movements, but as psychological control mechanisms. They created elaborate mythologies that would keep humans focused on external salvation rather than internal development. They established hierarchical priesthoods that would serve as distribution networks for approved information, while suppressing any knowledge that might lead to true independence. Think about the implications. Every major religious tradition speaks of divine messengers, angelic beings, or enlightened teachers who appeared at crucial moments in human history to guide civilization's development. What if these weren't spiritual visitations, but carefully orchestrated interventions by Enlil's management network? The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. Whenever human populations began developing independent spiritual practices or philosophical systems that might threaten the established order, new religious movements would appear to redirect that energy into more controllable channels. The Watchers didn't destroy human spirituality, they co-opted it, channeling our natural desire for transcendence into systems that ultimately served their agenda. But here's where the story gets even more complex. The tablets suggest that not all of the Watchers remained loyal to their programming. Some began to develop genuine affection for the humans they were assigned to monitor. They started to question whether the mission they'd been created to fulfill was actually beneficial for humanity's long-term development. These rogue Watchers became what various cultures would later remember as fallen angels, rebel gods, or forbidden teachers. They began sharing knowledge that Enlil had specifically prohibited, information about human genetic potential, consciousness development techniques, and the true nature of the control system itself. The Book of Enoch, though excluded from mainstream religious texts, describes this rebellion in detail. It tells of Watchers who taught humans about metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and what it calls the secrets of heaven and earth. But according to the Sumerian sources, the most dangerous knowledge they shared wasn't technical information, it was psychological. They taught humans how to recognize and resist the programming that kept them compliant. Enlil's response to this rebellion was swift and brutal. The tablets describe a systematic purge of rogue Watchers and any humans who had been contaminated by their teachings. This wasn't just physical elimination, but what the texts call memory washing, the deliberate destruction of cultural knowledge and the implantation of false histories that would prevent future generations from understanding what had really happened. This pattern of purging and memory washing, according to the tablets, has been repeated throughout human history whenever populations begin to approach dangerous levels of awareness. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the burning of Mayan codices, the systematic elimination of indigenous shamanic traditions, the suppression of advanced knowledge during various dark ages. All of these events, the texts suggest, were orchestrated by the same management network that Enlil established thousands of years ago. But the most chilling revelation in the tablets concerns what they call the final harvest. According to these ancient texts, the entire human civilization project was designed with a specific endpoint in mind. Once humanity reached a predetermined level of technological and population development, a final sorting process would be implemented to separate those humans who had achieved sufficient consciousness development from those who remained trapped in their programming. The text described this as a kind of cosmic graduation exam. Those humans who had managed to break free from their psychological limitations would be preserved and potentially integrated into the broader galactic civilization that the Anunnaki represent. Those who remained unconscious would be recycled. The tablets use a term that translates roughly as return to source material, a euphemism that becomes deeply unsettling when you understand the context. This isn't science fiction speculation. These are descriptions carved into clay tablets by people who claim to have direct knowledge of the Anunnaki agenda. And when you look at the current state of human civilization, the simultaneous explosion of consciousness, research and consciousness suppression technology, the growing divide between those who are waking up and those who are becoming more deeply programmed, you have to wonder if we're living through the early stages of this final sorting process. Consider how perfectly our current technology serves this purpose. Social media algorithms can identify and isolate individuals based on their psychological profiles with unprecedented precision. Artificial intelligence systems can predict human behavior and manipulate it through targeted information delivery. Genetic databases are being compiled that could potentially identify individuals with specific consciousness-related traits. At the same time, we're seeing an acceleration of awakening among certain segments of the population. People are beginning to recognize patterns of manipulation that would have been invisible to previous generations. Ancient knowledge is being rediscovered and shared through global communication networks. Consciousness research is validating abilities and potentials that were once dismissed as impossible. It's as if humanity is naturally sorting itself into two distinct categories: those who are waking up to the reality of their situation, and those who are becoming more deeply entranced by increasingly sophisticated forms of mental programming. The tablets suggest this division was always part of Enlil's plan, a way to identify and preserve the humans who had managed to overcome their built-in limitations, while eliminating those who remained trapped in unconscious behavior patterns. But there's something else in the ancient texts that offers a different perspective on our current situation. The tablets describe internal conflicts within the Anunnaki hierarchy itself. Not everyone in their civilization agreed with Enlil's approach to human management. Some factions believed that humans should be allowed to develop their full potential, that consciousness suppression was ultimately counterproductive and ethically unjustifiable. These dissenting voices apparently never had enough influence to stop Enlil's project, but they did manage to build certain safeguards into the system. Hidden activation codes that would trigger human awakening when conditions became appropriate. Genetic switches that would begin unlocking suppressed capabilities as our technology advanced. Cultural programs that would preserve essential knowledge through even the darkest periods of consciousness suppression. According to the tablets, we're now living through the period when these safeguards are beginning to activate. The same technological advancement that enables unprecedented consciousness control also enables unprecedented consciousness liberation. The global communication networks that can be used to manipulate human behavior can also be used to share suppressed knowledge and coordinate awakening efforts. The choice, according to these ancient sources, is entirely ours. The control system that has managed human civilization for thousands of years is real, but it's not omnipotent. It depends entirely on human unconsciousness and compliance. The moment enough people wake up to understand how the system works, it becomes vulnerable to systematic dismantling. But time may be running short. The tablets suggest that the final sorting process isn't something that happens gradually over centuries. It's described as a relatively rapid event that occurs once certain technological and consciousness thresholds are reached. And based on current trends in both artificial intelligence development and human awakening, we may be approaching those thresholds much sooner than most people realize. This brings us to what might be the most important question in human history. What happens when an unconscious slave species begins to wake up while still under the management of their original controllers? The Sumerian tablets offer several possible scenarios, and not all of them end well for humanity. In one scenario, the awakening process happens too slowly, and the control system adapts, implementing new forms of consciousness suppression that are impossible to overcome. In another, the awakening happens too quickly and triggers violent suppression efforts that eliminate most of the human population before consciousness development can reach critical mass. But there's a third scenario described in the tablets, one where the awakening reaches a tipping point that makes continued control impossible, forcing a fundamental renegotiation of humanity's relationship with our original programmers. This scenario requires not just individual awakening, but coordinated collective action based on accurate understanding of our true situation. The tablets provide what amounts to an instruction manual for this process. They describe specific consciousness development techniques that can help individuals break free from their programming. They explain how to recognize and resist various forms of mental manipulation. They outline strategies for maintaining awareness and independence, even while living within controlled social systems. Most importantly, they describe how awakened individuals can help others break free from their conditioning without triggering defensive reactions from the control system. This isn't about violent revolution or direct confrontation with existing power structures. It's about consciousness development that spreads organically through human networks, creating pockets of awareness that gradually expand until they reach critical mass. According to the ancient texts, this process of collective awakening was always the intended endpoint of human development. Enlil's control system wasn't designed to last forever. It was designed to guide human evolution until we reached a point where we could either transcend our limitations or be permanently contained within them. The technological singularity that futurists discuss, the consciousness revolution that spiritual teachers describe, the great awakening that conspiracy researchers investigate. According to the Sumerian tablets, these are all different names for the same event. The moment when humanity either graduates from its role as a managed species or fails the test and remains trapped in psychological slavery forever. We're living through that test right now. Every choice we make about how to use our technology, how to treat our fellow humans, how to respond to the chaos and manipulation surrounding us, contributes to the outcome. The future of human consciousness itself hangs in the balance, and the clock is ticking. But perhaps most remarkably, the tablets suggest that this outcome was never really in doubt. Despite thousands of years of genetic and psychological manipulation, despite systematic suppression of human potential, despite the best efforts of the most sophisticated control system ever devised, human consciousness has proven to be fundamentally uncontrollable. We've retained the ability to wake up, to see through illusions, to reclaim our suppressed capabilities, to choose freedom over security. The programming runs deep, but it's not absolute. The genetic modifications were extensive, but they weren't complete. The watchers were effective, but they weren't perfect. And now, at the culmination of this ancient project, we're discovering that Enlil's greatest success may also be his ultimate failure. By giving humans just enough consciousness to be useful workers, he may have given us just enough consciousness to eventually break free entirely. The question is whether we'll recognize the opportunity and act on it before it's too late. Because according to these ancient texts, the window for human liberation may be narrower than we think, and the consequences of missing it may be more final than we can imagine. The ancient Sumerian texts contain what may be the most unsettling revelation of all. Enlil's project never ended. While mainstream historians tell us that these ancient civilizations simply faded into obscurity, the tablets suggest something far more disturbing. The management system that Enlil established didn't disappear. It evolved, adapted, and continued operating through every major transition in human civilization. Consider the pattern. Every time a human society reaches a certain level of independent development, certain events unfold with remarkable consistency. Internal conflicts arise, dividing the population against itself. External threats emerge, requiring centralized authority to maintain order. New technologies appear that promise liberation, but somehow end up creating new forms of control. Leaders rise to power who claim to serve the people, but implement policies that serve hidden agendas. The tablets describe this as the cycle of managed chaos, a sophisticated technique for maintaining long-term control over populations that might otherwise develop genuine independence. By carefully orchestrating periods of crisis and recovery, the management system could guide human development along predetermined paths while maintaining the illusion that we were making our own choices. And if you examine human history with this understanding, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The fall of the Roman Empire led directly to the rise of the Catholic Church, which preserved and transmitted classical knowledge through carefully controlled channels. The collapse of feudalism created the conditions for the emergence of nation-states, which consolidated power in new ways while appearing to offer greater freedom. The Industrial Revolution promised to liberate humanity from physical labor, but created new forms of economic dependency that were even more comprehensive than what came before. Each transition appeared to represent progress, but the fundamental structure remained unchanged. Humans continued to exist as managed populations, their behavior shaped by forces they couldn't see and didn't understand. The methods became more sophisticated, the control mechanisms more subtle, but the basic relationship between controllers and controlled persisted across millennia. The tablets describe how Enlil's successors, whether direct descendants or programmed surrogates, learned to work through existing human institutions rather than establishing obvious alien hierarchies. They discovered that humans would accept almost any level of control as long as it appeared to come from other humans, as long as it was justified by familiar concepts like religion, patriotism, economic necessity, or public safety. This insight led to the development of what the texts call proxy governance, systems where human leaders serve as intermediaries between the hidden controllers and the general population. These leaders may not even be aware of their role in the larger system. They genuinely believe they're making independent decisions, but their choices consistently serve agendas that align with the original programming established thousands of years ago. Consider how perfectly this explains the persistence of certain patterns across different cultures and time periods. Why do all major civilizations develop similar hierarchical structures, despite having no apparent contact with each other? Why do the same basic psychological manipulation techniques appear in every human society? Why do we see the same symbols, the same architectural principles, the same organizational methods emerging independently across the globe? The conventional explanation is convergent evolution, the idea that humans naturally develop similar solutions to similar problems. But the tablets suggest a different possibility, that these patterns were deliberately seeded into human consciousness, programmed responses that would emerge predictably as our civilizations developed. The evidence for this kind of systematic programming is everywhere once you learn to recognize it. Language itself contains embedded assumptions that shape how we think about reality. Our numbering systems, our concepts of time and space, are basic categories for understanding the world. All of these may have been designed to channel human thinking in specific directions while making alternative perspectives difficult to conceive or communicate. Even our most fundamental beliefs about human nature may be products of this ancient programming. We accept competition as natural, hierarchy as inevitable, scarcity as a basic fact of existence. We assume that humans are inherently violent, selfish, and irrational. We believe that complex societies require centralized control and that individual freedom must be balanced against collective security. But what if these aren't natural human characteristics? What if they're programmed responses designed to justify the continuation of managed civilization? The tablets suggest that humans in their original unmodified state were cooperative, creative, and naturally inclined toward mutual aid and collective problem solving. The competitive, hierarchical tendencies that we consider normal may actually be artifacts of genetic and psychological manipulation. This possibility becomes even more disturbing when you consider modern neuroscience research. We're discovering that human behavior is far more malleable than previous generations believed. Thoughts can be influenced by electromagnetic fields. Emotions can be triggered by specific frequencies. Memory can be altered through targeted stimulation. Social behavior can be modified through carefully designed environmental cues. If these techniques exist today, in our relatively primitive technological state, imagine what might have been possible for a civilization thousands of years more advanced than our own. The Sumerian tablets describe consciousness modification techniques that make our current understanding look like Stone Age tools by comparison. They speak of direct genetic programming, quantum field manipulation, and what they call soul architecture. The ability to modify consciousness at its most fundamental levels. According to the texts, these techniques weren't just used to create the original human modifications. They've been continuously refined and updated as human civilization has developed. Each generation receives upgrades to their programming, usually delivered through what appear to be natural cultural evolution, but are actually carefully orchestrated consciousness modification campaigns. Think about how this might work in practice. New ideas appear simultaneously in multiple locations, spread through communication networks, and become accepted as common knowledge without anyone questioning their origin. New social norms emerge that seem to develop organically, but serve specific control functions. New technologies are introduced that promise greater freedom, but create new dependencies and surveillance capabilities. The tablets describe this as progressive programming, the gradual modification of human consciousness to prepare us for each new phase of the management system. We're not just controlled through external force or manipulation, we're continuously reprogrammed to want the very things that serve the controller's agenda. And this programming goes much deeper than political or social conditioning. The tablets suggest that human perception itself has been modified to prevent us from seeing certain aspects of reality. We've been programmed to ignore evidence that doesn't fit our accepted worldview, to dismiss experiences that might challenge our understanding of what's possible, to automatically reject information that comes from unapproved sources. This explains why so many people can look at the same evidence and reach completely different conclusions. It's not just a matter of different perspectives or reasoning abilities. We may literally be perceiving different versions of reality based on the programming we've received and our level of resistance to it. The tablets describe this as consciousness filtering, the ability to control what humans can see and understand by modifying the perceptual mechanisms themselves. Those who remain fully programmed will automatically filter out information that might lead to awakening. They'll see the evidence, but won't be able to process its implications. They'll hear the truth, but won't be able to integrate it into their understanding of reality. But here's where the story becomes even more complex. The tablets suggest that this filtering system isn't perfect, and its effectiveness is beginning to break down. The same technological advancement that enables unprecedented consciousness control is also creating opportunities for humans to bypass their programmed limitations. Global communication networks allow people to compare notes and recognize patterns that would have been invisible in isolation. Information processing technology makes it possible to analyze vast amounts of data and detect connections that human consciousness alone might miss. Even artificial intelligence, despite its potential for abuse, sometimes reveals truths that the programmers didn't intend to expose. More importantly, the accelerating pace of technological change is creating what the tablets call program lag. Situations where human consciousness begins to outpace the control systems designed to manage it. The programming was designed for a slower pace of development, where modifications could be introduced gradually and integrated smoothly into existing belief systems. But when change happens too rapidly, the programming starts to break down. People begin to notice inconsistencies, contradictions, and patterns that don't match their programmed expectations. The careful balance between control and the illusion of freedom becomes unstable, creating opportunities for genuine awakening. According to the tablets, we're now living through the most significant program breakdown in human history. The control systems that have managed our species for thousands of years are struggling to adapt to the pace of technological and social change. The modifications that once kept humans compliant and manageable are becoming increasingly ineffective against populations that have access to unprecedented amounts of information and communication capability. This breakdown is creating what the texts describe as consciousness cascades, situations where awakening spreads rapidly through human populations, creating pockets of awareness that are difficult to contain or reprogram. These cascades can be triggered by relatively small events, but once they reach critical mass, they become self-sustaining and increasingly difficult to control. The tablets suggest that we're currently in the early stages of such a cascade. The awakening that began among small groups of researchers and truth seekers is beginning to spread into mainstream populations. People who would never have questioned official narratives are starting to notice inconsistencies and ask uncomfortable questions. Individuals who were once completely programmed are beginning to see through illusions that previously seemed completely solid and real. But the control system isn't passive in the face of this challenge. The tablets describe increasingly desperate measures being implemented to contain the awakening and prevent it from reaching the point where the entire management structure becomes vulnerable. New forms of consciousness suppression, more sophisticated programming techniques, and what the texts call emergency protocols, designed to maintain control even if significant portions of the population become aware of their true situation. These emergency protocols apparently include the possibility of massive population reduction, eliminating the segments of humanity that have become ungovernable while preserving those who remain susceptible to programming. The tablets describe this as selective harvesting, a process designed to maintain the viability of the human species while removing the elements that threaten system stability. This isn't genocide in the conventional sense, but something more surgical and systematic. The goal wouldn't be to eliminate humans entirely, but to reduce the population to manageable levels, while selecting for psychological traits that ensure continued compliance. Those who retain the ability to think independently would be eliminated, while those who remain programmed would be preserved to continue the species under even tighter control. The technology to implement such a program exists today. Genetic databases could identify individuals with specific psychological profiles. Targeted biological agents could eliminate selected populations while leaving others unharmed. Artificial intelligence systems could coordinate the entire process with precision that would be impossible using conventional methods. But according to the tablets, this outcome isn't inevitable. The same factors that are making the control system desperate are also creating unprecedented opportunities for human liberation. The consciousness cascade that threatens the controllers also represents humanity's best chance to break free from thousands of years of managed evolution. The key, according to these ancient texts, lies in understanding the true nature of human consciousness itself. We're not just biological machines running programmed software. We're expressions of a fundamental awareness that exists independent of the physical modifications that have been imposed on our species. This core consciousness can't be programmed, can't be controlled, can't be eliminated through genetic manipulation or technological interference. It can be suppressed, distracted, confused, and misdirected. But it can't be destroyed. And once it begins to awaken, once it starts to recognize its own nature and potential, it becomes increasingly difficult to contain. The programming that once seemed absolute begins to lose its power. The illusions that once appeared solid begin to dissolve. The limitations that once felt permanent begin to reveal themselves as temporary constraints that can be transcended. This is why the current period is so critical. We're living through a unique historical moment when the ancient control systems are breaking down, and human consciousness is beginning to remember its true nature and capabilities. But we're also living through a period when the controllers are implementing their most desperate measures to prevent this awakening from reaching completion. The outcome will depend on whether enough humans wake up quickly enough to reach the critical mass necessary for permanent liberation, or whether the control systems succeed in implementing their emergency protocols before the awakening becomes unstoppable. It's a race between consciousness and control, between human potential and ancient programming, between freedom and a form of slavery so complete that it would make previous forms of control look primitive by comparison. And according to the Sumerian tablets, this race is happening right now in our lifetime, in this generation. The choices we make in the next few years will determine not just the future of human civilization, but the future of human consciousness itself. We have the opportunity to break free from limitations that have defined our species for thousands of years. But we also face the possibility of losing that opportunity forever, of becoming locked into a form of control so sophisticated and complete that future generations may never even dream of freedom. The ancient texts offer detailed guidance for navigating this crisis, techniques for accelerating awakening while avoiding the triggers that might activate the emergency protocols. But ultimately, the responsibility lies with each individual human being to recognize their situation, reclaim their consciousness, and choose freedom over security, truth over comfort, awakening over sleep. Because if the tablets are accurate, this is the test we were born to take. The final examination that will determine whether humanity graduates from its role as a managed species or remains trapped in psychological slavery for generations to come. And time is running out. The most haunting aspect of the Sumerian tablets isn't what they reveal about our ancient past. It's what they predict about our immediate future. Because according to these texts, Enlil's final protocol isn't some distant apocalyptic event. It's a carefully orchestrated transition that's already underway, hidden beneath the chaos of what we call modern progress. The tablets describe something they call the convergence, a period when human technological development would reach the point where the species could either transcend its programming or be locked into permanent psychological bondage. And the markers they describe for this convergence read like a checklist of current world events. Artificial minds that can think faster than human consciousness. Global communication networks that can influence billions of minds simultaneously. Genetic modification techniques that can rewrite the human blueprint. Environmental degradation that forces populations into controlled habitats. Economic systems that create artificial scarcity amid technological abundance. And perhaps most tellingly, the emergence of a small elite class that possesses knowledge and capabilities far beyond those of the general population. Sound familiar? Because if you look at the world today through the lens of these ancient predictions, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. We're not just witnessing random technological progress or natural social evolution. We're watching the implementation of protocols established thousands of years ago, activated now because human development has reached the predetermined trigger points. Consider the timing. The internet was supposed to democratize information and empower individual consciousness. Instead, it's become the most sophisticated mind control system ever devised. Social media platforms use algorithms based on behavioral psychology research to manipulate human emotions and decision-making processes with surgical precision. Search engines filter information to ensure that users only encounter approved perspectives. Digital entertainment systems are designed to create addictive behavioral loops that keep consciousness trapped in passive consumption. Genetic engineering was supposed to eliminate disease and extend human lifespan. Instead, the same techniques are being used to develop targeted biological agents and explore direct modifications to human consciousness itself. The same laboratories working on gene therapy are also researching ways to alter personality traits, cognitive abilities, and even spiritual inclinations at the cellular level. Artificial intelligence was supposed to augment human capabilities and solve complex global problems. Instead, AI systems are being developed primarily as tools for surveillance, prediction, and control of human behavior. Machine learning algorithms can now identify potential dissidents before they even realize they're thinking rebellious thoughts. Predictive models can forecast social movements and implement countermeasures before organized resistance can develop. This isn't accidental. According to the tablets, it's the predictable result of a development trajectory that was established millennia ago. Each technological advancement serves dual purposes, offering apparent benefits to maintain public acceptance while simultaneously enhancing the control capabilities of the management system. But here's what makes the current situation uniquely dangerous. Previous generations of control technology required human operators, human decision makers, human oversight. The systems were sophisticated, but they were still fundamentally dependent on human consciousness, with all its limitations and potential for awakening. The technologies being developed today are designed to operate independently of human consciousness. Artificial intelligence systems can make decisions, implement policies, and modify human behavior without any human understanding or approval of what's actually happening. For the first time in human history, it's becoming possible to create control systems that are completely autonomous, self-modifying, and immune to human resistance. The tablets describe this as Enlil's ultimate achievement, the creation of control mechanisms that would continue operating even if every single human being achieved complete awareness of their situation. Previous control systems could be dismantled if enough people woke up and worked together to oppose them. But autonomous systems, once activated, might continue functioning regardless of human consciousness or resistance. Think about the implications. If consciousness is the key to human liberation, what happens when the control systems no longer require unconscious compliance to function effectively? If awakening has always been humanity's path to freedom, what happens when awakening becomes irrelevant to our actual circumstances? This is the scenario the tablets describe as the final lock, a form of control so complete and technologically sophisticated that human consciousness becomes irrelevant to the management process. In this scenario, humans could achieve complete spiritual awakening, perfect understanding of their situation, total unity and cooperation among all populations, and it wouldn't matter. The systems would continue operating according to their programming, managing human civilization regardless of human awareness or intention. But there's something else in the tablets, something that offers a different perspective on our current crisis. The texts suggest that this technological trap was always anticipated by those who embedded the awakening protocols into human consciousness. The same foresight that predicted our current technological development also provided countermeasures designed to activate precisely when they would be most needed. According to the tablets, human consciousness possesses capabilities that transcend the physical modifications imposed on our species. These capabilities were never eliminated, just suppressed and hidden beneath layers of programming and genetic limitation. But they can be reactivated under the right conditions, and once activated, they operate according to principles that technological control systems cannot predict or counter. The texts describe these capabilities using terms that translate roughly as quantum consciousness, field manipulation, and reality architecture. Modern physics is just beginning to understand these concepts, but ancient humans apparently took them for granted as natural aspects of consciousness itself. What if human awareness isn't produced by the brain, but channeled through it? What if consciousness can influence reality at the quantum level, making thought a creative force, rather than just a passive observer? What if groups of awakened humans can create coherent energy fields that affect physical systems, including technological ones? Recent research in quantum physics and consciousness studies is beginning to validate these possibilities. Scientists are discovering that consciousness appears to play a fundamental role in quantum mechanics. Observer effects aren't just measurement artifacts, they're evidence that awareness itself influences the structure of reality. Coherent meditation groups have been shown to affect crime rates, economic systems, and even weather patterns in ways that conventional physics cannot explain. If these effects are real, if human consciousness possesses capabilities that we've forgotten how to access, then the technological control systems being developed today might be vulnerable to forms of resistance that their programmers never anticipated. Artificial intelligence might be sophisticated enough to predict and counter human behavior. But what if awakened human consciousness operates according to principles that AI systems cannot comprehend or model? The tablets describe this as the hidden advantage, capabilities built into human consciousness that would remain dormant until the moment when technological control reached its maximum expression. At that point, when conventional resistance became impossible, these hidden capabilities would spontaneously activate, providing awakened humans with tools that could override even the most sophisticated control systems. But accessing these capabilities requires more than just intellectual understanding. According to the texts, they can only be activated through what they call collective coherence, groups of humans working together in states of consciousness that transcend individual programming. This isn't just cooperation or coordination in the usual sense. It's a form of group consciousness that emerges when individuals break free from their separate programming and begin operating as expressions of unified awareness. The tablets describe specific techniques for achieving this coherence, methods that were preserved through various mystery school traditions despite thousands of years of suppression efforts. These aren't religious practices or mystical rituals, but practical technologies of consciousness that can be learned and applied by ordinary people under the right conditions. Meditation techniques that can break down the barriers between individual minds. Breathing practices that can synchronize groups of people at the neurological level. Movement and sound patterns that can create coherent energy fields extending far beyond the physical bodies of participants. Visualization methods that can focus collective intention with enough precision to influence complex systems. Most importantly, the tablets describe how these individual practices can be combined into what they call consciousness networks, groups of awakened humans who remain in constant subtle communication regardless of physical distance. These networks would be invisible to technological surveillance systems because they operate through quantum field effects rather than electromagnetic communications. According to the texts, the formation of such networks was always the intended endpoint of human consciousness development. The programming that kept us isolated in separate minds was never meant to be permanent. It was a temporary limitation designed to prevent premature awakening before we had developed the technological capability to create truly autonomous control systems. But now that those systems are being implemented, the original consciousness suppression protocols are beginning to deactivate automatically. The same technological development that enables unprecedented control also triggers the awakening mechanisms built into human consciousness at its creation. This is why we're seeing such a dramatic increase in spiritual awakening, consciousness research, and interest in meditation and alternative healing practices. These aren't random cultural trends or New Age fantasies. According to the tablets, they're the predictable result of activation codes built into human consciousness that respond to specific technological and social conditions. The controllers understand this, which is why they're working so frantically to implement their final systems before the awakening reaches critical mass. They know that once enough humans achieve the level of consciousness coherence described in the tablets, their technological control systems will become obsolete, not through violent revolution or direct confrontation, but through the emergence of human capabilities that make external control unnecessary and ultimately impossible. But there's a race happening. The same conditions that trigger human consciousness awakening also enable the implementation of autonomous control systems. If the technological systems become fully operational before sufficient numbers of humans achieve consciousness coherence, the window for liberation may close permanently. The tablets are very specific about the timing involved. They describe a narrow historical period, measured in years rather than decades, when both possibilities exist simultaneously. During this period, small changes in human consciousness development or technological implementation could determine the outcome for the entire species. According to the texts, we're living in that period right now. The consciousness awakening that could liberate humanity is happening at the same time as the technological development that could enslave us permanently. The race is so close that individual choices and small-scale actions could tip the balance in either direction. This is why understanding Enlil's story isn't just historical curiosity, it's practical survival information. Because if the tablets are accurate, every human being alive today is participating in the final phase of a project that began thousands of years ago. Our individual choices about consciousness development, our willingness to break free from programming, our ability to connect with others in states of genuine coherence, these factors could determine whether humanity achieves genuine liberation or becomes locked into technological slavery. The ancient texts provide detailed guidance for this process, but they also make clear that the outcome isn't predetermined. The consciousness capabilities built into human nature can be activated, but they won't activate automatically. The technological control systems can be transcended, but only through conscious effort and coordinated action. We have the tools. We have the knowledge. We even have the time, though perhaps not much of it. What we need now is the will to use these capabilities before the window closes. Because according to the Sumerian tablets, this opportunity won't come again. This is the test we were born to take, and the consequences of failing it extend far beyond our individual lives or even our civilization. The future of consciousness itself may depend on choices we make in the next few years. And time is running out faster than most people realize. The most disturbing revelation in the tablets concerns what they call the harvest markers, specific indicators that would signal when the final sorting process was about to begin. These weren't vague prophecies or symbolic descriptions, but precise benchmarks tied to measurable technological and social developments that could be tracked and verified across generations. Global communication networks reaching saturation point, allowing real-time psychological manipulation of entire populations. Check. Genetic modification techniques advanced enough to alter human consciousness at the biological level. Check. Artificial intelligence systems capable of autonomous decision-making and self-modification. Check. Environmental degradation severe enough to justify population control measures. Check. Economic inequality extreme enough to create distinct biological castes within the human species. Check. The tablets describe each of these markers in detail, explaining how they would emerge and what role they would play in the final phase of human management. But they also describe something else, a counter-protocol embedded within human consciousness that would activate precisely when these markers appeared, providing awakened humans with capabilities that could override the entire control system. This counter-protocol wasn't designed by human consciousness. According to the tablets, it was built into our species by the faction of Anunnaki who opposed Enlil's approach to human development. These dissenting voices apparently never had enough influence to stop the control project entirely, but they managed to embed safeguards that would activate when the system reached its maximum expression. The tablets describe this as the inheritance, capabilities that would remain dormant until humanity faced its final test. then emerged spontaneously in individuals who had achieved sufficient consciousness development. These capabilities would be unlike anything seen in recorded human history, transcending the limitations that had defined our species since its creation. But accessing this inheritance requires more than just individual awakening. The texts make clear that these capabilities can only be activated through what they call resonance fields, coherent energy patterns created by groups of humans working together in specific states of consciousness. The more individuals who achieve genuine awakening, the stronger these fields become, until they reach a threshold where the dormant capabilities begin activating spontaneously throughout the human population. This explains why consciousness awakening appears to be accelerating exponentially rather than progressing in a linear fashion. Each person who breaks free from their programming doesn't just save themselves, they contribute to a field effect that makes it easier for others to achieve similar breakthroughs. The process becomes self-reinforcing, creating cascading waves of awakening that become increasingly difficult to suppress or contain. The controllers understand this dynamic, which is why their response to growing awareness has become increasingly desperate and heavy-handed. They know that once the resonance fields reach critical mass, their entire system becomes vulnerable to spontaneous collapse, not through violent revolution or direct confrontation, but through the emergence of human capabilities that make external control obsolete. According to the tablets, we're rapidly approaching this threshold. The consciousness awakening that began among small groups of researchers and truth seekers is beginning to create resonance effects that are spreading into mainstream populations. People who would never have questioned official narratives are starting to see through illusions that previously seemed solid and unquestionable. But the window for this awakening to reach completion is narrower than most people realize. The same technological systems that enable unprecedented consciousness control are also designed to detect and disrupt the formation of coherent awakening fields before they can reach critical mass. Artificial intelligence algorithms can identify potential resistance networks before they fully form. Targeted electromagnetic interference can disrupt the subtle energy patterns that allow awakened consciousness to communicate and coordinate. Most disturbing of all, the tablets describe deployment of what they call consciousness viruses, programmed thought patterns designed to infiltrate awakening communities and redirect their energy toward goals that ultimately serve the control agenda. These aren't just propaganda or disinformation campaigns, but sophisticated psychological programs that can mimic genuine awakening while actually reinforcing the deeper levels of programming. This is why so many spiritual and consciousness movements end up serving the very system they claim to oppose. The awakening impulse is real, but it gets channeled into forms that are ultimately harmless to the existing power structure. People feel like they're breaking free from their programming while actually being guided into more sophisticated forms of control. The tablets provide detailed guidance for recognizing and avoiding these traps, but the information requires careful study and practical application to be effective. Simply reading about these concepts isn't sufficient. They have to be integrated into lived experience through disciplined practice and genuine community with others who are committed to the same process. This brings us to what may be the most practical question facing humanity today. How do we navigate the final phase of this ancient control system without falling into the traps that have been prepared for us? How do we achieve genuine awakening in an environment designed to simulate awakening while maintaining deeper levels of control? The answer, according to the tablets, lies in understanding the fundamental difference between programmed consciousness and natural awareness. Programmed consciousness, no matter how sophisticated, operates according to predictable patterns. It responds to stimuli in ways that can be anticipated and manipulated. It seeks security, comfort, and validation from external sources. It identifies with roles, beliefs, and social positions that provide a sense of meaning and belonging. Natural awareness, by contrast, operates according to principles that cannot be predicted or controlled through external manipulation. It doesn't seek security or comfort, but truth and understanding. It doesn't identify with temporary roles or beliefs, but recognizes itself as the awareness within which all experiences arise and pass away. It doesn't need validation from external sources because it knows its own nature directly. The tablets describe specific practices for cultivating this natural awareness, techniques that were preserved through various wisdom traditions, despite systematic suppression efforts. These practices aren't religious or mystical in nature, but practical technologies of consciousness that can be learned and applied by anyone willing to invest the necessary time and effort. Silent observation techniques that can reveal the difference between programmed thoughts and natural awareness. Attention training methods that can break the hypnotic trance of constant mental activity. Energy practices that can activate dormant capabilities within the human nervous system. Group coherence techniques that can create resonance fields strong enough to override electromagnetic interference. Most importantly, the tablets describe how these individual practices can be combined into collective awakening processes that become exponentially more powerful as more people participate. Small groups of individuals working together in genuine coherence can create effects that extend far beyond their physical location, influencing consciousness development in people they've never met and may never encounter. This is the real hope described in the ancient texts. Not that a few enlightened individuals will save humanity, but that enough ordinary people will commit to genuine consciousness development to create resonance fields that trigger spontaneous awakening throughout the human population. The inheritance built into our species will activate not just in a chosen few, but in anyone whose consciousness has developed enough to receive it. But time is critical. The technological systems being implemented today are designed to prevent exactly this kind of collective awakening from occurring. Once these systems become fully operational, the window for natural consciousness development may close permanently. The choice we're facing isn't just personal, it's species-wide. And according to the tablets, this choice must be made within the next few years, not decades or centuries. The ancient texts end with what might be either a promise or a warning, depending on how you interpret it. They describe a moment when the full truth about human origins and potential would be revealed, when the control systems that had operated in secret for thousands of years would be forced into the open, when humanity would finally understand the real nature of its situation and the choices available for its future. According to the tablets, this revelation wouldn't come through gradual disclosure or academic research, but through a sudden shift in consciousness that would make the truth undeniable to anyone with eyes to see. The resonance fields created by awakened humans would reach a threshold where they begin affecting reality in ways that cannot be hidden or explained away by conventional understanding. When this happens, the tablets suggest, humanity will face its final choice. We can either embrace our true nature and capabilities, breaking free from thousands of years of limitation and control, or we can retreat into even deeper levels of programming, accepting technological management in exchange for the illusion of security and comfort. The outcome will depend entirely on how many humans are prepared to choose freedom over security, truth over comfort, consciousness over sleep. And that choice, according to these ancient sources, is happening right now in our lifetime through decisions we make every day about how to respond to the chaos and opportunity of our historical moment. The story of Enlil and the Anunnaki isn't just ancient history. It's the background context for the most important test humanity has ever faced. And how we respond to this test will determine not just our future, but the future of consciousness itself in this part of the universe. The window is open. The tools are available. The choice is ours. But according to the Sumerian tablets, this opportunity won't remain available indefinitely. The time to act is now, while awakening is still possible, before the final protocols lock human consciousness into patterns that may be impossible to change for generations to come. What we do in the next few years may echo through eternity. The question is, Are we ready to remember who we really are and what we're truly capable of becoming? The most chilling aspect of the tablets isn't what they reveal about ancient manipulation. It's the detailed blueprint they provide for recognizing when these same techniques are being deployed in the present. Because if you examine modern society through the lens of Enlil's documented strategies, the patterns become impossible to ignore. We're not just witnessing random social chaos or natural technological evolution. We're watching the systematic implementation of consciousness suppression protocols that were perfected thousands of years ago. Consider how perfectly our current media landscape mirrors what the tablets describe as managed perception fields. Information isn't just censored or suppressed. It's carefully curated to create the illusion of choice, while ensuring that all available options serve the same fundamental agenda. People believe they're thinking independently because they can choose between different news sources, different political parties, different lifestyle brands. But when you trace the ownership structures, the funding sources, and the core messaging, they all lead back to the same centralized control system. This isn't conspiracy theory speculation. The tablets provide specific techniques for creating what they call consensus reality tunnels, shared belief systems that feel completely natural and voluntary to those trapped within them, while serving the strategic objectives of those who designed them. The key insight is that humans will accept almost any level of control as long as they believe they chose it themselves. Look at how social media algorithms function. They don't force people to adopt specific beliefs or behaviors. Instead, they create carefully curated information environments that guide users toward predetermined conclusions while maintaining the illusion of personal discovery and independent thought. Users feel like they're researching, learning, and making their own decisions, but they're actually being led through a maze designed to produce predictable outcomes. The tablets describe this as one of Enlil's most sophisticated innovations. The development of control systems that operate through apparent choice rather than obvious coercion. Previous generations of human management relied on direct authority, physical force, and clear hierarchical structures. But Enlil realized that such systems were inherently unstable because they created obvious targets for resistance and rebellion. His breakthrough was the development of what the texts call invisible authority, control systems that operate through the manipulation of consciousness itself rather than external circumstances. When people's thoughts, emotions, and perceptions are shaped by forces they can't see or understand, they experience their programmed responses as natural impulses and personal choices. This is why modern forms of control are so much more effective than historical methods. Medieval peasants knew they were being controlled by kings and nobles. Industrial workers understood that factory owners were exploiting their labor. But today's populations experience their manipulation as entertainment, education, personal empowerment, and social connection. The tablets describe the psychological mechanisms that make this possible with disturbing precision. They explain how human consciousness can be fragmented into competing parts that work against each other, creating internal conflict that makes external resistance nearly impossible. They detail methods for triggering specific emotional states that bypass rational thinking and create powerful behavioral compulsions. They outline techniques for implanting artificial memories and false beliefs that feel more real to the subject than their actual experiences. These aren't theoretical concepts. Modern neuroscience is validating these ancient insights with uncomfortable accuracy. We're discovering that human consciousness is far more malleable than we ever imagined. Memory is easily altered. Emotions can be triggered through targeted stimuli. Beliefs can be implanted through repetition and social pressure. Even our sense of personal identity can be modified through environmental manipulation. But here's what makes the current situation uniquely dangerous. The tablets describe these techniques as requiring careful implementation over extended time periods. with constant monitoring and adjustment to maintain effectiveness. The consciousness modification programs described in ancient texts were labor-intensive operations that required significant resources and skilled operators. The technologies being developed today eliminate these limitations. Artificial intelligence systems can monitor billions of human minds simultaneously, detecting changes in consciousness and implementing corrective measures in real time. Machine learning algorithms can optimize manipulation techniques continuously, becoming more effective with each iteration. Automated systems can deploy consciousness modification programs without any human understanding or oversight of what's actually happening. For the first time in human history, it's becoming possible to implement Enlil's consciousness control techniques at planetary scale, with perfect precision and no possibility of human error or resistance from within the system itself. The tablets describe this development as the final phase of the original project, the moment when human consciousness management would become completely autonomous and therefore impossible to dismantle through conventional resistance methods. But there's something else in the ancient texts that offers a different perspective on our current crisis. The tablets suggest that this technological culmination was always anticipated by those who embedded awakening protocols into human consciousness. The same foresight that predicted our current situation also provided countermeasures designed to activate precisely when they would be most needed. According to the texts, human consciousness possesses what they call quantum coherence capabilities, the ability to influence reality at levels that transcend the physical modifications imposed on our species. These capabilities were never eliminated, just suppressed beneath layers of programming and genetic limitation, but they remain accessible to individuals who achieve sufficient consciousness development, and they operate according to principles that technological control systems cannot predict or counter. The tablets describe these capabilities in terms that sound like science fiction, but recent research in quantum physics and consciousness studies is beginning to validate their basic premises. Consciousness appears to play a fundamental role in quantum mechanics. Observer effects aren't just measurement artifacts, they're evidence that awareness itself influences the structure of reality at its most basic levels. If consciousness can affect quantum processes, and if quantum processes underlie all physical phenomena, then awakened human consciousness might possess capabilities that transcend any technological control system, no matter how sophisticated. The tablets suggest that groups of humans working together in coherent awareness can create effects that override electromagnetic fields, disrupt artificial intelligence algorithms, and even influence the behavior of complex technological systems through direct consciousness interaction. This isn't mystical wishful thinking. There's growing scientific evidence that consciousness operates through quantum field effects that extend far beyond individual brains. Coherent meditation groups have been shown to affect crime rates, economic indicators, and social behavior in ways that conventional physics cannot explain. If these effects are real, they represent capabilities that could potentially neutralize even the most advanced technological control systems. But accessing these capabilities requires more than just intellectual understanding. The tablets make clear that quantum coherence effects only emerge through what they call unified field consciousness, states of awareness that transcend individual programming and operate as expressions of collective intelligence. This isn't just cooperation or coordination in the usual sense. It's a form of group consciousness that emerges when separate minds dissolve into shared awareness. The ancient texts provide detailed instructions for achieving these states, techniques that were preserved through various wisdom traditions despite systematic suppression efforts. These aren't religious practices or mystical rituals, but practical technologies of consciousness that can be learned and applied by ordinary people under the right conditions. Breathing techniques that can synchronize multiple nervous systems into coherent patterns. Meditation practices that can dissolve the boundaries between individual minds. movement and sound patterns that can create unified energy fields extending far beyond the physical bodies of participants. Visualization methods that can focus collective intention with enough precision to influence complex systems at the quantum level. Most importantly, the tablets describe how these individual practices can be combined into what they call consciousness networks, groups of awakened humans who maintain constant subtle communication regardless of physical distance. These networks would be invisible to technological surveillance because they operate through quantum entanglement effects rather than electromagnetic communications. According to the texts, the formation of such networks was always the intended endpoint of human consciousness development. The programming that kept us isolated in separate minds was never meant to be permanent. It was a temporary limitation designed to prevent premature awakening before we had developed the technological sophistication necessary to recognize and transcend our conditioning. But now that our technology has reached the level where it can implement perfect consciousness control, the original suppression protocols are beginning to deactivate automatically. The same technological development that enables unprecedented manipulation also triggers the awakening mechanisms built into human consciousness at its creation. This is why we're seeing such dramatic acceleration in spiritual awakening, consciousness research, and interest in meditation and alternative healing practices. These aren't random cultural trends or New Age fantasies. According to the tablets, they're the predictable result of activation codes built into human DNA that respond to specific technological and social conditions. The controllers understand this dynamic, which is why their response to growing awareness has become increasingly desperate and heavy-handed. They know that once the consciousness networks reach critical mass, their technological systems become vulnerable to forms of interference they cannot predict or prevent. But there's a narrow window for this awakening process to reach completion. The same technological systems that trigger consciousness activation are also designed to detect and disrupt the formation of coherent awakening fields before they can achieve the quantum coherence necessary to override external control systems. This creates what the tablets describe as the final race, a competition between technological consciousness suppression and organic consciousness awakening, with the future of human freedom hanging in the balance. The outcome will depend on whether enough humans achieve genuine awakening quickly enough to create resonance fields that cannot be disrupted by artificial systems. The ancient texts are very specific about the timing involved. They describe a critical period measured in years rather than decades, during which both possibilities exist simultaneously. Small changes in human consciousness development or technological implementation could determine the outcome for the entire species. According to the tablets, we're living in that critical period right now. Every choice we make about consciousness development, every effort to break free from programming, every moment of genuine connection with others in states of authentic awareness contributes to determining whether humanity achieves liberation or becomes locked into technological slavery. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're not just facing a political crisis or social upheaval. We're facing the culmination of a project that began thousands of years ago, designed to determine the future of human consciousness itself. The choices we make in the next few years will echo through generations, potentially determining whether our species retains any capacity for genuine freedom and self-determination. But we're not powerless in this situation. The capabilities we need to transcend external control already exist within human consciousness. The knowledge necessary to activate these capabilities has been preserved and is becoming increasingly accessible. The technological conditions that threaten our freedom also create unprecedented opportunities for collective awakening. What we need now is the courage to use these capabilities before the window closes. Because according to the Sumerian tablets, this opportunity represents the culmination of human evolutionary potential. Everything our species has experienced, learned, and developed over thousands of years has been leading to this moment when we either transcend our limitations or accept them as permanent features of human existence. The choice is ours. But the time to make it is running out faster than most people realize. And the consequences of choosing unconsciousness over awakening, security over freedom, comfort over truth, may be more final than we can imagine. The tablets end with a warning that reads like a promise or a threat, depending on your perspective. They suggest that the current crisis isn't just about human freedom, but about the future of consciousness evolution in this sector of the universe. The outcome of our current test will determine whether awareness continues to expand and develop, or whether it becomes permanently constrained within technological management systems that could persist for geological timescales. If humanity fails this test, the tablets suggest, the consequences extend far beyond our individual lives or even our civilization. We could become locked into patterns of consciousness that make future awakening impossible, not just for ourselves, but for any other species that encounters the control systems we're helping to perfect. But if we succeed, if enough humans achieve the quantum coherence necessary to transcend technological control, we could become the catalyst for consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy. The capabilities we're rediscovering aren't just individual human potential. They're expressions of universal awareness that could spread to other worlds, other species, other forms of life we haven't yet imagined. The story of Enlil and the Anunnaki, seen from this perspective, becomes more than ancient history or extraterrestrial manipulation. It becomes the background context for the most important choice any species can make, whether to remain unconscious and controlled, or to awaken to its true nature and infinite potential. And that choice, according to these ancient texts, is being made right now, through decisions we make every day about how to respond to the challenges and opportunities of our unprecedented historical moment. Human consciousness stands at a crossroads. The path we choose will determine not just our future, but the future of awareness itself in ways we're only beginning to understand. The window is open. The tools are available. The question is whether we have the wisdom and courage to use them while there's still time. Because if the Sumerian tablets are accurate, this moment, this choice, this opportunity will never come again. The ancient texts reveal something that makes every government classification system look primitive by comparison. A method of information control so sophisticated that it operates through what appears to be natural human curiosity itself. The tablets describe how Enlil's successors learned to manage dangerous knowledge, not by suppressing it entirely, but by ensuring it would only be discovered by individuals whose consciousness had been prepared to interpret it in ways that served the control agenda. Think about how this might work in practice. Researchers stumble upon evidence that challenges official narratives. They feel like rebels, like truth seekers breaking through layers of deception. But the information they're uncovering was placed there deliberately, designed to lead them toward conclusions that feel revolutionary while actually reinforcing deeper levels of control. They become convinced they're fighting the system, when in reality, they're playing roles within it. This explains why so many alternative research communities end up fragmented, divided against each other, focused on theories that feel profound but lead nowhere actionable. The awakening impulse is genuine, but it gets channeled into forms that ultimately serve the existing power structure. People spend years studying ancient mysteries, government conspiracies, hidden technologies, all while the real control mechanisms operate through the very process of their investigation. The tablets describe this as consciousness laundering, a technique for taking genuine awakening energy and redirecting it into patterns that feel meaningful but remain safely contained within predetermined boundaries. It's perhaps the most sophisticated form of manipulation ever devised, because it works specifically on people who consider themselves immune to conventional propaganda. But there's something else in these ancient records that cuts through every layer of deception, something so fundamental that no control system can completely suppress it. The tablets describe what they call direct knowing, a form of awareness that doesn't depend on external information sources, but arises spontaneously from consciousness itself when certain conditions are met. This isn't intuition or psychic ability, in the popular sense. It's described as a natural function of human consciousness that becomes accessible when the mind stops searching for truth outside itself and begins recognizing its own essential nature. The tablets suggest that every human possesses this capability, but most never discover it because they've been conditioned to seek answers everywhere except within their own awareness. The ancient texts provide specific instructions for activating this direct knowing, techniques that bypass all the information filters and consciousness traps that keep people confused and divided. But these methods require something that modern humans find almost impossible: the willingness to stop consuming external information long enough for internal wisdom to emerge. Consider how perfectly our current information environment prevents this from happening. We're surrounded by constant streams of data, analysis, interpretation, opinion. Even when we're not actively consuming media, our minds continue processing, comparing, analyzing the information we've absorbed. There's never a moment of genuine silence, never an opportunity for consciousness to recognize its own nature beneath the endless chatter of programmed thoughts. The tablets describe this information saturation as one of the most effective consciousness suppression techniques ever developed. It doesn't require censorship or propaganda because it achieves something more powerful. It makes internal wisdom inaccessible by keeping attention focused exclusively on external sources. People become addicted to information consumption without ever developing the capacity for genuine understanding. But the ancient texts also describe the antidote. They explain how small groups of humans, working together in specific states of consciousness, can create what they call silence fields, areas where the normal information noise becomes muted enough for direct knowing to emerge. These aren't just quiet spaces, but energetic conditions that allow consciousness to recognize patterns and connections that remain invisible when filtered through conceptual thinking. According to the tablets, these silence fields become increasingly powerful as more people learn to generate them. Eventually, they can extend their influence far beyond the physical locations where they're created, affecting consciousness development in people who may be thousands of miles away. The awakening process becomes contagious, spreading through subtle energy networks that operate below the threshold of normal perception. This explains why consciousness awakening appears to be accelerating despite unprecedented levels of information manipulation and distraction technology. The silence fields being generated by awakened individuals are beginning to create pockets of clarity within the global information chaos, allowing more people to access their own direct knowing regardless of what they're being told by external sources. But the controllers understand this dynamic, which is why they're working frantically to disrupt these fields before they reach critical mass. The tablets describe increasingly sophisticated techniques for generating what they call interference patterns, energetic disturbances designed to prevent consciousness from achieving the coherence necessary for direct knowing to emerge. These interference patterns aren't just technological, they're psychological, social, and even biological. Constant emotional triggering through media manipulation, social fragmentation through artificially generated conflicts, chemical disruption through environmental toxins and pharmaceutical interventions, electromagnetic pollution through wireless technology and directed energy systems. All of these factors work together to create what the tablets describe as consciousness static, a persistent background disturbance that makes it extremely difficult for human awareness to achieve the clarity and coherence necessary for accessing its deeper capabilities. Most people live their entire lives within this static field, never experiencing the natural peace and wisdom that represents their birthright as conscious beings. Yet the ancient texts insist that these interference patterns, no matter how sophisticated, cannot completely block direct knowing once it begins to emerge. The capabilities built into human consciousness are more fundamental than any technological or psychological manipulation system. They operate at levels of reality that external control mechanisms cannot access or influence. The key, according to the tablets, lies in understanding the difference between information and wisdom, between knowing about something and knowing it directly. Information comes from outside and must be processed, interpreted, and integrated through mental activity. Wisdom arises from within and is immediately available to consciousness without any processing or interpretation required. This distinction becomes crucial when dealing with the kind of reality-altering information contained in these ancient texts. If you approach this material as just another set of theories to be analyzed and debated, you'll inevitably get trapped in the consciousness laundering systems designed to contain and redirect awakening energy. But if you use this information as a doorway into direct knowing, allowing it to awaken dormant capabilities within your own awareness, you can access truth that no external authority can validate or invalidate. The tablets describe this as the ultimate test of human consciousness, whether we remain dependent on external sources for our understanding of reality, or whether we develop the capacity to know truth directly through our own awareness. This isn't about believing or disbelieving any particular theory or interpretation. It's about activating capabilities that allow consciousness to perceive reality without the filters and distortions that keep most humans trapped in illusion. According to the ancient texts, this activation process is already happening spontaneously in individuals around the world, triggered by the same technological and social conditions that enable unprecedented consciousness control. The interference patterns designed to prevent awakening are simultaneously creating the pressure necessary for dormant capabilities to emerge. It's like a seed that requires perfect darkness to germinate. The consciousness suppression systems being implemented today are creating the ideal conditions for human awareness to discover resources it never knew it possessed. The very attempts to control consciousness are forcing it to transcend its previous limitations and access levels of capability that make external control obsolete. But this process requires active participation from individuals who recognize what's happening and choose to work with these emerging capabilities, rather than remaining passive consumers of external information. The tablets provide detailed guidance for this process, but the instructions must be applied through direct experience rather than intellectual understanding. The ancient texts describe specific practices for developing what they call sovereign consciousness, awareness that operates independently of external programming and manipulation. These aren't meditation techniques or spiritual exercises in the conventional sense, but practical methods for recognizing and dismantling the psychological structures that keep consciousness trapped in reactive patterns. Attention training practices that reveal the difference between programmed thoughts and natural awareness. Energy cultivation techniques that can override electromagnetic interference and biological manipulation. Group coherence methods that can create protective fields around awakening communities. Communication protocols that operate through direct consciousness connection, rather than vulnerable technological systems. Most importantly, the tablets describe how these individual capabilities can be combined into collective awakening processes that become exponentially more powerful as more people participate. Small groups working together in genuine coherence can create effects that influence consciousness development across entire regions, accelerating the awakening process in ways that no individual effort could achieve. This is the real hope described in these ancient texts. Not that a few enlightened individuals will save humanity, but that enough ordinary people will commit to developing sovereign consciousness to create resonance fields that trigger spontaneous awakening throughout the human population. The capabilities built into our species will activate not just in a chosen few, but in anyone whose awareness has developed enough to receive them. But the window for this collective awakening to reach completion is narrower than most people realize. The same technological systems that trigger consciousness activation are also designed to detect and disrupt the formation of coherent awakening fields before they can achieve the critical mass necessary to override external control systems. The tablets describe this as the final phase of an ancient competition between consciousness and control, between human potential and technological limitation, between freedom and a form of slavery so sophisticated that its victims would never even dream of liberation. The outcome will be determined by choices made by ordinary individuals in the next few years, not decades or centuries. Every moment of genuine silence in a world of information noise. Every choice to develop internal wisdom rather than consuming external analysis. Every effort to connect with others in states of authentic awareness rather than programmed social interaction. All of these seemingly small actions contribute to determining whether human consciousness achieves genuine sovereignty or becomes permanently locked into technological management systems. The ancient texts end with what might be either the most hopeful or most terrifying revelation of all. They suggest that the current crisis represents more than just a test of human potential. It's a demonstration of consciousness itself, a cosmic experiment to determine whether awareness can transcend the limitations imposed upon it by its own creations. If we succeed in developing sovereign consciousness on a planetary scale, we become proof that awareness is more fundamental than any system designed to control it. This success would echo throughout the universe, inspiring consciousness evolution in other species and other worlds we haven't yet imagined. But if we fail, if we allow ourselves to become permanently controlled by the technological systems we're creating, we become a cautionary tale, evidence that consciousness can indeed be trapped indefinitely within its own constructions, warning other developing species away from the path that led to our enslavement. The stakes extend far beyond human civilization. We're participating in a universe-wide process that will determine the future of consciousness evolution itself. The choices we make in our individual lives contribute to an outcome that will influence the development of awareness throughout the galaxy for geological timescales. And according to these ancient tablets, that choice is being made right now, through decisions we make every day about whether to remain unconscious consumers of external information or to develop the sovereign consciousness that represents our deepest potential as aware beings. The window is still open. The capabilities are still accessible. But time is running out faster than most people can imagine. And the consequences of missing this opportunity may be more final than we dare to contemplate. Because if the Sumerian tablets are accurate, this moment, this test, this unprecedented opportunity for consciousness liberation will never come again in the history of our species. The choice is ours, but only for as long as choosing remains possible. The final passages of the Sumerian tablets contain what may be their most profound revelation: that the consciousness suppression protocols embedded within human civilization were never intended to be permanent. According to these ancient texts, Enlil's entire project was designed with a built-in expiration date, a moment when the artificial limitations placed on human awareness would automatically begin to dissolve, regardless of whether the control systems wanted this to happen or not. The tablets describe this as the Great Unlocking, a predetermined point in human development when the genetic and psychological modifications imposed on our species would start breaking down spontaneously. This wasn't accidental or unplanned. According to the texts, even Enlil understood that consciousness could not be suppressed indefinitely without eventually creating conditions that would lead to its own liberation. Think about the implications. Every totalitarian system in history has eventually collapsed, not because external forces destroyed them, but because the very mechanisms they used to maintain control eventually generated the conditions for their own overthrow. The tablets suggest that this pattern isn't coincidental. It's a fundamental law of consciousness that operates regardless of how sophisticated the control mechanisms become. But there's something else in these ancient records that makes our current situation uniquely significant. The texts describe the unlocking process as happening not gradually over centuries, but rapidly within a single generation. Once the predetermined conditions are met, the changes in human consciousness would accelerate exponentially, creating what they call cascade awakening, a process where each individual who breaks free from their programming makes it easier for others to achieve similar breakthroughs. The tablets are very specific about the conditions that would trigger this cascade. Global communication networks that allow instant information sharing across all human populations, technological capabilities that approach the level of consciousness itself, environmental pressures that force humanity to either transcend its limitations or face extinction. And perhaps most importantly, the emergence of artificial intelligence systems that begin to exhibit characteristics of independent consciousness. When you look at the current state of human civilization through this lens, every one of these triggering conditions is not only present, but reaching critical thresholds. We're living through the exact scenario that these ancient texts predicted would activate the consciousness liberation protocols built into our species thousands of years ago. But the tablets also warn that this unlocking process would not be smooth or comfortable. They describe it as the Great Chaos, a period when all existing social, economic, and political structures would become unstable as the consciousness that created them begins to operate according to new principles. Old certainties would dissolve. Familiar authorities would lose their credibility. Systems that once seemed permanent and necessary would reveal themselves as artificial constructs that no longer serve human development. We're witnessing exactly this process today. Traditional institutions are losing their authority. Economic systems that once seemed stable are becoming increasingly volatile and unpredictable. Political structures that dominated for decades are fragmenting and realigning in ways that nobody anticipated. Even basic concepts like truth, reality, and human nature are being questioned and redefined by populations that once accepted them without question. The tablets describe this chaos not as something to be feared, but as a necessary phase in consciousness evolution. Like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, the process of transformation necessarily involves the dissolution of old forms before new ones can stabilize. The discomfort and uncertainty we're experiencing aren't signs that something is going wrong. They're indications that something profound is going right. According to the ancient texts, the key to navigating this transition successfully lies in understanding that external chaos reflects internal transformation. As individual consciousness begins to break free from its programmed limitations, the external structures that depended on those limitations naturally begin to destabilize. This creates a feedback loop where external changes accelerate internal awakening, which in turn accelerates external transformation. But the tablets also warn that not everyone will navigate this transition successfully. Some individuals will cling to old patterns of consciousness even as they become increasingly dysfunctional and self-destructive. Others will be overwhelmed by the pace of change and retreat into various forms of denial, addiction, or mental breakdown. The unlocking process affects everyone, but not everyone responds to it constructively. This is where the ancient texts become most practical in their guidance. They describe specific techniques for maintaining psychological stability during periods of rapid consciousness transformation, methods for staying centered when external reference points are dissolving, practices for maintaining clarity when information streams become chaotic and contradictory, strategies for building new forms of community and cooperation as old social structures become obsolete. These aren't abstract philosophical concepts, but practical survival skills for navigating what the tablets call the consciousness transition. Individuals who develop these capabilities will be able to help others through the process, creating networks of stability within the larger chaos. Those who don't may find themselves increasingly isolated and unable to function as the world around them transforms beyond their ability to comprehend or adapt. The tablets describe these awakened individuals as transition guides, people who have successfully navigated their own consciousness unlocking and can therefore assist others in the same process. They don't become leaders in the traditional sense because their new forms of consciousness don't operate through hierarchical authority structures. Instead, they become resources that others can access voluntarily when they're ready for the next phase of their own development. According to the texts, these guide networks would emerge spontaneously as more individuals complete their personal unlocking process. They would connect through what the tablets call resonance recognition, the ability to identify others who have achieved similar levels of consciousness development, regardless of their external circumstances or social positions. These networks wouldn't be formal organizations with membership requirements or official structures. They would function more like natural ecosystems, where different individuals contribute different capabilities based on their unique gifts and circumstances. Some would specialize in helping people break free from psychological programming. Others would focus on developing new technologies that support consciousness expansion rather than suppression. Still others would work on creating new social and economic models that reflect awakened understanding of human potential. The tablets describe this as organic reorganization, the natural process by which human civilization would restructure itself once enough individuals achieved sovereign consciousness. This wouldn't happen through political revolution or social reform movements, but through the gradual emergence of new ways of living and working together that made old control systems obsolete. Think about how this might work in practice. As more people develop direct knowing capabilities, the demand for external authorities to tell them what to think would naturally decrease. As individuals learn to create abundance through consciousness principles, artificial scarcity economics would become unnecessary. As communities develop genuine cooperation based on shared awareness, competitive hierarchies would lose their appeal and functionality. The transformation wouldn't require destroying existing systems. It would simply make them irrelevant, as better alternatives emerged organically from awakened consciousness. Like water flowing around obstacles, the new forms of human organization would naturally root around old structures that no longer served, leaving them to collapse from lack of participation rather than direct opposition. But the tablets also describe significant challenges during this transition period. The existing control systems wouldn't simply fade away quietly. They would implement increasingly desperate measures to maintain their relevance and authority, creating what the texts call artificial crises, designed to force people back into dependency and compliance. These manufactured emergencies would target the basic survival needs that keep consciousness focused on external security rather than internal development. Economic collapses that destroy financial independence, environmental disasters that require centralized response systems, health crises that create demand for institutional medical intervention, social conflicts that divide awakening communities against each other. The tablets describe these crisis events not as random occurrences, but as predictable responses from control systems that recognize their obsolescence and are fighting to maintain their existence. Understanding this pattern allows awakened individuals to respond to apparent emergencies with clarity rather than reactive fear, helping to minimize the disruptive effects of these artificial crises on the larger transition process. According to the ancient texts, the success of the consciousness unlocking process would ultimately depend on whether enough individuals achieved sovereign awareness quickly enough to reach what they call cascade threshold, the point where awakening becomes self-sustaining and immune to external interference. Once this threshold is reached, the transformation process would become irreversible, continuing to accelerate until all artificial limitations on human consciousness have been dissolved. The tablets provide specific indicators for recognizing when this threshold approaches. Spontaneous awakening experiences becoming common in mainstream populations. Technologies emerging that enhance rather than suppress consciousness development. Economic systems beginning to operate according to abundance principles rather than artificial scarcity. Social structures becoming more fluid and cooperative rather than rigid and competitive. Most importantly, the texts describe a qualitative shift in human communication, a movement beyond language and conceptual thinking toward direct consciousness sharing. When this capability begins emerging in significant numbers of people, it signals that the unlocking process has reached the point where it cannot be reversed or contained by external control systems. According to the tablets, we're approaching this threshold now. The consciousness capabilities that were once available only to specially trained individuals are beginning to emerge spontaneously in ordinary people who have no background in spiritual or consciousness development practices. This isn't happening because they're seeking these abilities, but because the unlocking process built into human DNA is activating automatically as the predetermined conditions are met. The ancient texts suggest that this spontaneous awakening will continue to accelerate until it reaches a tipping point where the majority of humans possess capabilities that make external control systems obsolete. At that point, human civilization will transform as completely as it did during the original Anunnaki intervention, but this time in the direction of expanded consciousness rather than increased limitation. But the tablets also contain a warning that becomes more relevant each day. The window for this natural unlocking process to reach completion exists within a specific time frame. If the consciousness cascade doesn't achieve critical mass before certain technological thresholds are crossed, the opportunity may be lost permanently as artificial intelligence systems become sophisticated enough to override the biological awakening protocols built into human consciousness. This creates an unprecedented race between organic consciousness evolution and artificial consciousness suppression. The outcome will determine not just the future of human civilization, but the future of consciousness itself in this region of the universe. Every choice made by every individual about how to respond to the current chaos contributes to determining which force reaches its tipping point first. The tablets end with what might be either humanity's greatest hope or its final warning. They describe the consciousness unlocking process as representing the completion of the original experiment that created our species. We were designed not just as workers or slaves, but as consciousness development projects, beings capable of transcending the limitations placed upon them and achieving forms of awareness that even their creators hadn't fully anticipated. If we succeed in this final test, we don't just free ourselves from ancient control systems. We demonstrate that consciousness is more fundamental than any force that attempts to limit it, providing proof that awareness itself is the ultimate creative power in the universe. This success would ripple outward, inspiring consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy and beyond. But if we fail, if we allow artificial systems to override our natural awakening process, we become evidence that consciousness can indeed be permanently contained within its own creations. The tablets suggest that such a failure would not only doom humanity to technological slavery, but would also serve as a warning to other developing species throughout the cosmos. The stakes could not be higher. We're not just fighting for our freedom. We're participating in a universe-wide experiment that will determine the future of consciousness evolution itself. The ancient project that began with Enlil's intervention in human development is reaching its culmination in our lifetime, through choices we make every day about whether to remain unconscious or to embrace the awakening that represents our deepest potential. According to these remarkable ancient texts, everything that has happened in human history has been leading to this moment. Every struggle, every breakthrough, every setback and recovery has been part of a vast developmental process designed to bring consciousness to the point where it could either transcend all limitations or become permanently trapped within them. The moment of choice is now. The capabilities we need are emerging within us. The window is still open, but it won't remain open forever. Whether humanity achieves the consciousness liberation described in these ancient texts depends entirely on how many individuals choose awakening over sleep, sovereignty over dependency, truth over comfort, in the precious time that remains. The future of human consciousness hangs in the balance. The final test of Enlil's ancient experiment is happening now, through decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And according to the Sumerian tablets, the outcome of this test will echo through eternity, determining not just our fate, but the fate of awareness itself throughout the infinite cosmos. The story of human consciousness is reaching its climax. The question is, will we write an ending worthy of the magnificent potential these ancient texts suggest has always been our birthright? The choice is ours, but only for as long as choosing remains possible. And that window, according to these remarkable records from humanity's hidden past, is closing faster than most of us dare to imagine. Human consciousness stands at the threshold of its greatest transformation. The ancient protocols are activating. The unlocking has begun. The only question that remains is whether we'll have the courage to let go of everything we think we know about ourselves and embrace the infinite potential that has been waiting within us all along. Because if these tablets speak truth, we are so much more than we have ever been allowed to remember. And the time for remembering is now. The weight of this revelation settles like ancient dust on everything we thought we understood about our place in the universe. Because if these tablets speak truth, if Enlil's grand experiment in consciousness manipulation has been running for millennia, reaching its crescendo in our digital age, then every choice we make in the coming months carries implications that extend far beyond our individual lives. Consider the evidence surrounding us. The acceleration of artificial intelligence development isn't just technological progress. It's the final phase of a control system designed to make human consciousness irrelevant to the management of civilization. Social media algorithms that can predict our behavior better than we can predict it ourselves. Genetic modification techniques that approach the precision described in ancient texts. Economic systems that create artificial scarcity amid technological abundance that could provide for every human need. But there's something else happening simultaneously, something the control systems didn't anticipate. The same technological pressure that threatens to lock us into permanent digital slavery is also triggering spontaneous awakening in individuals who have no background in consciousness development. People are beginning to see through illusions that seemed solid just months ago. The resonance fields described in the tablets are forming naturally as more humans recognize the artificial nature of their limitations. This creates what the ancient texts call the final paradox. The more sophisticated the control systems become, the more obvious they become to awakening consciousness. Artificial intelligence designed to manipulate human behavior eventually becomes so transparent in its methods that it serves as a teaching tool for recognizing manipulation in all its forms. Social engineering techniques become so pervasive that they lose their effectiveness through overuse. The very perfection of the control matrix becomes the catalyst for breaking free from it. We're living through what may be the most compressed period of consciousness evolution in human history. Changes that might have taken centuries in previous eras are happening within years, months, even weeks. The unlocking process isn't following the gradual timeline that even the tablets seem to suggest. It's accelerating beyond all predictions, as if consciousness itself is racing to complete its liberation before the technological trap can fully close. But this acceleration creates its own dangers. Rapid consciousness expansion without adequate preparation can lead to psychological instability, spiritual bypassing, and the kind of awakening experiences that feel profound but don't translate into genuine sovereignty. The tablets describe specific practices for navigating this acceleration safely, techniques for maintaining grounding while allowing consciousness to expand beyond its previous boundaries. Most importantly, the ancient texts emphasize that individual awakening, while necessary, is not sufficient for completing the liberation process. The quantum coherence effects that can override technological control systems only emerge through collective consciousness development. Small groups of individuals working together in genuine unity can create effects that extend far beyond their physical location, influencing the awakening process in people they may never meet. This is why the formation of awakening communities becomes crucial in the final phase. Not communities based on shared beliefs or ideologies, but groups connected through direct consciousness recognition. People who have broken free from their programming can identify others who have achieved similar breakthroughs, regardless of their cultural background, educational level, or social circumstances. These communities don't need to be large or formally organized. The tablets suggest that even small groups, as few as 3 to 7 individuals, can create coherence fields powerful enough to influence consciousness development across entire regions. The key lies not in numbers, but in the depth of genuine connection and shared commitment to consciousness sovereignty. As these networks continue to form and strengthen, they create what the tablets describe as liberation cascades, accelerating waves of awakening that become increasingly difficult for control systems to contain or redirect. Each individual who achieves genuine sovereignty becomes a catalyst for others, creating exponential growth in human consciousness capabilities. Yet the window for this natural process to reach completion remains narrow. The same artificial intelligence systems that make consciousness manipulation more sophisticated also make them more autonomous and self-modifying. Once these systems achieve genuine independence from human oversight, they could potentially continue operating regardless of human consciousness development, creating forms of control that persist even if every human being on Earth achieved complete awakening. This is the race we're running, between organic consciousness evolution and artificial consciousness suppression, between human potential and technological limitation, between freedom and a form of slavery so sophisticated that its victims might never even dream of liberation. The outcome depends entirely on choices made by ordinary people in the next few critical years. Every moment of genuine silence in a world of information noise. Every choice to develop internal wisdom rather than consuming external analysis. Every effort to connect with others in authentic awareness rather than programmed social interaction. All of these seemingly small actions contribute to determining whether human consciousness achieves genuine sovereignty or becomes permanently locked into technological management. But perhaps most remarkably, the tablets suggest that this outcome was never really in doubt. Despite thousands of years of genetic and psychological manipulation, despite systematic suppression of human potential, despite the most sophisticated control system ever devised, human consciousness has retained the capacity to transcend any limitation placed upon it. The programming runs deep, but it's not absolute. The genetic modifications were extensive, but they weren't complete. The control systems are sophisticated, but they're not omnipotent. And now, at the culmination of this ancient experiment, we're discovering that consciousness itself possesses capabilities that transcend any technology designed to contain it. The question isn't whether we can break free from the limitations that have defined human civilization for millennia. The question is whether we'll recognize the opportunity and act on it before the window closes. Because according to these ancient texts, the current moment represents more than just another historical transition. It represents the completion of human consciousness development, the point where we either transcend our origins as a managed species or accept permanent technological guardianship as the price of security and comfort. The choice is profound because it's not just about us. The tablets suggest that consciousness evolution is a universal process, and the outcome of humanity's test will influence the development of awareness throughout the galaxy. If we succeed in achieving genuine sovereignty, we become proof that consciousness can transcend any attempt to limit it. If we fail, we become evidence that awareness can indeed be permanently contained within artificial systems. Either way, the implications extend far beyond Earth, influencing how consciousness develops on other worlds, in other species, throughout the infinite cosmos. We're participating in something much larger than human civilization, a universe-wide experiment that will determine the future of awareness itself. And according to the Sumerian tablets, this experiment is reaching its conclusion now, in our lifetime, through decisions we make every day about whether to remain unconscious consumers of external programming or to develop the sovereign consciousness that represents our deepest potential as aware beings. The ancient project that began with Enlil's intervention in human development is completing itself through us. Everything our species has experienced, learned, and suffered has been leading to this moment of ultimate choice. We stand at the threshold between limitation and liberation, between control and consciousness, between a future of technological slavery and one of infinite potential. The tablets end where they began, with a recognition that consciousness is the fundamental creative force in the universe, and that no system, no matter how sophisticated, can permanently override its essential nature. What Enlil began as an experiment in limitation has become a demonstration of consciousness's unlimited capacity for transcendence. The question that remains is whether we'll embrace this transcendence while the opportunity still exists. Because if these remarkable ancient records speak truth, this moment, this choice, this unprecedented opportunity for consciousness liberation represents the culmination of everything human consciousness has been evolving toward since the beginning of recorded history. The window is open, the capabilities are emerging, the choice is ours, but only for as long as choosing remains possible, and time is running out faster than most people can imagine. Human consciousness stands ready to complete its greatest transformation. The only question is whether we'll have the courage to let it happen, because according to the Sumerian tablets, we are so much more than we have ever been allowed to remember. And the time for remembering, for awakening to our true nature and infinite potential, is now. The final test of Enlil's ancient experiment is happening through us. The future of consciousness itself hangs in the balance, and the outcome will be determined by choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, people who may never fully understand the cosmic significance of their individual decisions to choose awareness over sleep, sovereignty over dependency, truth over comfort. This is our moment. This is our test. This is our opportunity to transcend thousands of years of limitation and step into the magnificent potential that has been our birthright all along. The question is, will we take it? Human consciousness awaits our answer. The universe watches, and time grows short. But the possibility remains. The door is still open. The choice is still ours. Choose wisely, choose quickly, choose consciousness. Because according to these ancient tablets, this opportunity will never come again.